Hey everyone, welcome back to my shed. Sorry about the lighting here. We're about to get a nor'easter, so the weather's pretty crappy, so I have the tent set up here too. Today we are going to work on putting cedar shakes on the shed. Full disclosure, I've never done cedar shakes before, so what I've actually done is I've already went ahead and shaked 3 sides of the shed so I could try a few methods, figure out what worked and what didn't work, so you don't have to. So we're gonna go ahead, we're gonna jump right in on the front. I'm gonna go through what I found to be the quickest and most effective way to get the shingles up on the house. Okay, so since it's about to downpour here, we're gonna be working underneath this tent where I already have all the tools set up, and the side of the shed that we're gonna be siding is actually under the porch, so we should be protected from the rain as long as it's not blowing too much. The lighting's going to be bad. I apologize for that, but this is the only day I have to finish this up, so we're going to go ahead and make it happen today. Bare minimum to do this project, you're going to want a good utility knife, carpenter's pencil, a hammer, and I really think that this can't be done or can't be done well without a chalk line. Now, staying on tools, now if we want to take this up a notch, if there was one power tool I would bring to this job, it would be this, a pneumatic stapler. This is a 16 gauge 7/16 Senko stapler. I'll have a link to this and as well as all the tools that I used in the description below. This is where you're going to save all of your time. We talked about the pneumatic stapler for fastening the shingles up. The next power tool that I would invest in is something to cut with. And if I only could pick one thing to cut with for this entire job, I'd pick a jigsaw. The reason why I'm suggesting a jigsaw is inevitably you're going to have some notch cuts around windows, on dormers. The jigsaw is just going to be the best utility saw to do all of your cuts without having to revert back to some sort of manual method. That said, I have some other equipment here that made this job really, really easy for me. The first piece is just a circular saw. The other 2 pieces of equipment that I brought out, my smaller portable miter saw, my portable table saw. I found from just a speed perspective, having the miter saw and the table saw just set up, ready to go, has made things go a lot faster. Okay, so the last thing is consumables as far as supplies, and there's a couple of things that you're going to need. So the first, if you're going to go with a pneumatic nailer, make sure you have some pneumatic tool oil. This will make a big difference in whether or not you're jamming or not jamming, especially if you're working in dirty or wet conditions. This will be a lifesaver. Again, depending on your method of choice, I'm going to show you the chalk line method just because I had such good success with it. You're going to want yourself some good high visible chalk. I like this orange color. It's just really easy to see. You are going to need some type of wood siding nail for ending courses and around windows and doors, etc. It needs to either be stainless steel, like these are in this case, or it needs to be galvanized. You're also going to need the crown staples for the stapler itself. The last thing you're going to need is you're going to need some exterior caulk. Alright, so I wanted to take 1 second to talk about corners. And really this is something you need to figure out before you start putting any siding on the shed at all. There's really two main methods when you're shaking a building. And that's either this trim method where all your corners are wrapped in trim, and the other method is to what's called weaving your corners. So that's where you would have your shakes come directly to the end of the building, and then on the other side you'd match up that shape. Now, if you go with this method, you can see there's a lot more work involved here. You're going to have to trim down the exposed shingle on every course. You're going to have to make sure that, you know, on this run, this one was on the inside. The next course up, I have to flip those. So this one would become the butt, and this one would go over it. And you need to do that so that water sheds properly. Ultimately, weaving the shingles like this is a much more refined look. I do think it looks a lot better, but my house has the trim, as well as the majority of the houses in my neighborhood and area in general. have utilized the trim method, so I'm going to go ahead and stick with that now. Fortunately, sticking with the trim method also makes life a lot easier, because now all we're doing is we're butting the shingles up against it, leaving a little bit of gap so that we can put some caulking in there to make it watertight, but it does really make the application a lot easier. It also has the benefit of I do not need to make certain that my courses line up perfectly from this face to this face. If I was weaving all of these corners, I'd have to go all the way around the building. I'd have to take into account every obstruction on any face of the building, whether it be a door or window, and I'd have to account for that on my story pole when I'm figuring out my reveal, and that becomes really difficult because we're going to use the trim on the corners. It doesn't matter if this course here is perfectly aligned with this course here. The only thing that matters is it's close, because visually your eye is going to have a real hard time determining that this course isn't 100% in line with the corresponding course over here. I can fudge this over here. I can be about a ½ inch off from that side, and you'll never know. We're going to go ahead and we're going to go with this kind of slightly askew method on the premise that nobody's really going to notice it anyways. And when you'll hear people refer to this as either a storyboard or a story pole. All it is a way of marking your courses. This is really the hardest part of the whole process. First, determining your measurements for your courses, making sure that all your courses are going to start where you want them. And by that, what I mean is you want your course to come nice and parallel across the top of window openings, across the top of door openings. So you need to adjust your exposure a little bit. By exposure, what I mean is the amount of the shingle that's showing. So I've been using a 5-inch exposure around the entirety of the building, and on sides where I have no obstructions, I have a true 5-inch exposure everywhere. On sides where I have obstructions, like on the gable end with the barn doors, leading up to the top of the barn door and then coming off the top of the barn door, I had to adjust my exposure a little bit so that I could make sure a course landed right across the top of the door. So if you were to measure my courses, you'll see that all my courses from the ground to the top of the door are actually 1/16 off. So they're 5 and 1/16 exposure versus 5, and that slight adjustment got me exactly to the top of the door. Now, visually, you're never going to notice a 1/16 of an inch, and there was a few courses that I corrected by even more than that. I think my largest correction on a course was 1/4 of an inch. Visually, you can't see these things, but making these adjustments really helps with the application of the shingles, as well as the final quality of the installation, and allowing them to shed water properly over obstacles in the wall, such as the door or windows. Okay, we got the story pole all figured out with our measurements for the front wall, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to transfer the marks from the story pole. First place will be the edge on the right side, the edge on the left side, and then we're also going to transfer the lines to both sides of the door casing, and as well as the applicable lines we're going to transfer to each side of the window casings. That's just going to make it easier as we start going up with the courses to keep things straight. So for instance, when we get in between the windows here, that's such a short span. This is where your level's really going to come in handy. It's a lot easier to literally just line up the level on your marks, draw a quick line with your pencil, rather than taking out the chalk line and doing it that way. Alright, so your first course of shingles does need to be a double layer of shingles, and since they're going down on this deck, I'm going to lift them up 1/4 of an inch. So to get that 1/4 of an inch, I'm just going to use the shingle itself at the widest point, and I'm going to start firing these up. next thing we need to do is figure out exactly which method we want to use to get the shakes up onto the building. Now, I looked into this. I found really two main methods. Method one was essentially creating a jig. The jig was basically a board, a long straight board with two pieces of wood on either end that you use to set to your line. So you would tack it in on each end, you'd have the board going across your wall, and you would just lay up the shingles down the board, and then you could come back with a nail gun and fire them all in. I found that method to be more of a hassle than a help. It's great for just throwing the shingles up there and nailing fast, but you're not losing your time on the nailing. That's not the time-consuming part of the process, especially if you invest a couple of bucks in a pneumatic nailer. So what I found best is the second method, and the method I'm going to use it to show you, which is just simply using a chalk line to snap a line from your points that you just marked, and then all you're doing is you're grabbing the shingle, you're placing it against the building on the chalk line, and firing two fasteners into it. Now, the reason why I found this one worked the best for me was because inevitably, especially when I was working with the D quality shingles, you had to do a little shimmying with the shingles. You couldn't always get them to line up properly so that the bottom edge of the course not only looked nice, but that you didn't have any ridiculous gaps in between two abutting shingles. And by that what I mean is the cuts on some of the shingles, some of them are very, very square, but especially on the D grade, you'll get some that share out, kind of have some curves in it. If you're using the method of just placing the board up, it makes it very difficult because you ultimately end up shifting stuff around. Then the shingles that you placed up there got in your way, so you're not really saving any time by having them all lined up. Now, that said, I can totally see how if you're using grade A shakes, totally perfect, clear, mostly uniform in size, that is going to be by far your fastest method of getting the shakes on the house. Even with the C's, could probably get away with it, but I started off with the D's and I got really, really fast at using this chalk line approach, and I like the flexibility it gave me to manipulate the shingles a little bit more. So it's up to you which approach you take. I highly suggest going with the chalk line approach. It just seemed to make life a lot easier, and the other benefit of it is there's no setup time for a jig. I'm not tacking in a jig, moving it, making sure it's in line, etc. Literally, I run the chalk line, snap the line, start firing up shingles. From a time perspective, I honestly, the low quality shingles, C's and D's, I think it's actually faster using the string line. If I had A's, I'm just guessing, but I suspect it would be faster using the jig, because even the additional time of setting up and moving the jig, that's most likely going to be negated by the fact that you're just going to get to flip these shingles up and fire them in super fast, again, because you're working with a nicer product, a more uniform product. But we're going to go ahead and stringline this. Now that we have our chalk line, it's just as easy as grabbing a pile of shakes and working our way back across. As we do this, we want to be mindful of the separations between the shakes. Ideally, you're not putting the next course's seam directly on top of a seam below. So you want to keep like a half an inch between the seams, so staggering them. Obviously, the more the better. And again, this is where, the more uniform the product, so like an A or a B, the easier it is to keep your seams staggered without having to shuffle through the pile of shingles. The C's and D's, I have found that a lot of times you're fumbling to find the right one, or you're cutting something, or you're doing something that's taking more time. We're going to go ahead and we're going to get the next course on here. So every now and then this happens where the last shingle you put on is a little skew, and you can either pivot this one where the bow is, but if you do that, you end up with a pretty wide gap down on the bottom here. And obviously some gap is okay, but too much of a gap isn't going to look good, especially since the shingles are still going to contract a little bit. So what you do to get around that is you just take your utility knife and you carve off a little bit of the shingle so that you can angle the next one in. So just carve off a little piece like that, and that should allow us to curve that, and now we're nice and straight on the line, and we only have a little tiny gap over here. Alright, so the next course is going to be in line with the top of this plate that's going around the outlet. But you'll notice that the previous course, actually the two previous courses, extend above the outlet cover. Obviously, we had to cut the shingles that were interrupted by the outlet cover, but we're now going to be in a position where the next shingle layer that we put on here, we got to overcome probably a ½ an inch of depth from the shingles that we added on there. Now, how we're going to do that is we're just going to take another shingle and put it down there, and a -- inch and a ¼ inch will get us the ½ inch we need. Now, if this wasn't under an overhang like it is here, or if this was on my house, I'd also be putting a piece of drip edge over here, but no rain gets underneath here, or very little rain gets underneath here. So I'm just going to go ahead and make sure I got that flare proper on the shingles. And you can see as far as rain goes, it's pouring out here now, and it's totally dry up here. Alright, so I'm going to talk about the shakes themselves for a second. In general, there's 4 grades of shakes. They're graded A, B, C, and D. A being the best, and D being the worst. D's will be marketed as not even shingles. They're marketed as a utility product, and oftentimes the description at the store will simply say, you know, not suitable for siding, not suitable for roofing, etc. Basically, the manufacturer's intention is for them to be used mainly as shims, and if you are going to attempt to use them in a siding project, you should expect to have somewhere between 25% and 35% of waste material. And what I mean by that is that the quality, you can use the shingles to side the house. However, the quality of the shingles themselves being D grade, there are many that are totally unusable. By unusable, what I mean is they're so spongy, there's rot in them, that they'll actually break or they'll just absorb the water that hits them. There's knots that are missing components of them so that the water could actually penetrate directly through. And in many cases, the size of the shingle itself is just totally unusable. In the D packages, the size of the shingle can range anywhere from, I think they say 2 inches, but I had some that were, you know, just barely over an inch, all the way up to 12 inches. So it's a wide range of widths of shingles. So that said, if you're going to use the D quality, you will get a very specific look, and we'll take a look at the sides, the 2 back sides of the shed that I used D grade shingles on, and you do get a very nice rustic look, including those knots and including those blemishes. That said, my waste, because I was being very selective of what I was including, was quite significant. I think I was on the upwards of 30 to 35% waste. Decided to switch to the C grade to do the front side and the side with the barn doors that are more viewable from my house. And I have to say that ultimately the look is just about the same between the D being super selective and using C's and not being selective at all. And by that, what I mean is I literally used almost every single shingle in the bundles. And the C's are a bit clearer, but generally you're still getting that rustic look. In my opinion, the C's were much easier to work with because there was less handling time. The D's, I had to sort through every bundle, figure out what I wanted to use, what was the best side to be using. There was just a lot of hands-on time with them. With the C grade shingles, you're removing all of that time. You can basically just grab from the top of the bundle and slam them up to the wall. So there's a massive, massive time savings. Now, cost. This one's a bit tricky and deceiving. So the D grade shingles, they come in bundles that cover 12.5 square feet. And the bundles at the time I purchased them were $34 a bundle. The C grade comes in a bundle of that has a coverage of 25 square feet. So exactly double of the D quality. And at the time I purchased them, a bundle was $70. So cost-wise, the C's, one bundle, was slightly more than double. However, if you take into account that you need 2 bundles of D's to equal the same square foot coverage as 1 bundle of C and equalize that, you're now talking a difference of $68 for 25 square feet of D coverage versus just over $70 for C coverage. So now it's a couple of dollars difference. Now equate the amount of waste. So there's essentially no waste using the C's. So I got to use the entirety of my $70 worth of shingles. On the D quality though, I wasted somewhere between 30 and call it 40%. So on a bundle that's essentially, let's call it $70, I wasted $28 worth of shingles. I just threw them out, that being the 40%. So in the long run, from a cost perspective, the D's are more costly because you're throwing more out, and they take a lot more time to handle, to install. So the takeaway from this is, do not buy D grade shingles. You are not saving yourself money. You are not saving yourself time. Go ahead and buy the C grade shingles. You'll end up with a similar look at less cost and easier application. So unfortunately, the nor'easter ended up turning into a bomb cyclone and completely rained me out, as well as, cause a bunch of damage to my backyard that I had to clean up. So I was not able to finish shaking the front of the shed. I'll have to pick that up in the spring, but I still wanted to get this video out for everybody this year. All right, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, please go ahead and consider subscribing, as well as checking out some other videos on the channel.